I am ready to rock and roll. It is 9:30 Pacific, and what we're going to do in about the next 30 minutes here on this LinkedIn Live is talk about the 3 sales hiring mistakes that kill B2B startups and how to avoid them. So let me just give you a little bit of background, and I'm sure that if you're a B2B startup founder, perhaps you're a co-founder that's in charge of sales, you're doing sales even if you don't consider yourself a salesperson. One of the things that you want to think about, of course, is in the future, and even now, you want to grow. You want to grow sales, you want to grow customers, you want to grow revenue. And one of the challenges, of course, is like, how do I find the right salesperson? How do I find the right sales team? Who do I hire? When do I hire them? What do I have them do? And the challenge, of course, is for most B2B startup founders is they've never actually run a sales team before. For the most part, most startup founders, especially in the tech world, people that have engineering backgrounds, product backgrounds, maybe finance backgrounds, analyst backgrounds, but they've never done sales and they've never managed a team. And that's why many times those early stage B2B companies, those founders make these sales hiring mistakes that I want to share with you today and how you can avoid them. So just to give you a little bit of context, so my background, I've spent about 20 years out here at Silicon Valley, and I've worked as the head of sales or the first head of VP of sales for 3 different tech startups. So first with Applia in the ed tech world, I work with an economist named Paul Romer. Some of you might recognize Paul Romer because he won the Nobel Prize last year in the field of economics. And he built a B2B tech, it's B2B because we were selling to universities and colleges. And we built a learning platform that was used for economics courses and then grew from there. That's what got me out to Silicon Valley way back in 2001, 2002. From there, I worked with a company called Altos Research, which sold data and analytics to the Wall Street market and to realtors, real estate realtors and brokers. And most recently, back in 2012, 13, 14, 15, was the head of sales at Blend, which is now one of the most recent unicorns in the fintech world with their lending platform. And so today, what I do every day is working with Sales Qualia in my company. We help B2B startups start up, ramp up, and scale up their sales process. And sales hiring is always one of the most important questions or topics or challenges that the companies that we coach every single day in our startup selling coaching program. This is one of the biggest challenges that they have when thinking about when's the right time to hire, who do I hire, when do I hire, and how do I avoid, in a lot of cases, some of the mistakes I may have made in the past when I've done sales hiring in the past. And so what we want to do here is take a look at, like, what's the outcome that you want? I mean, ultimately what you want is you want to build this team of superheroes, right? You want to build this team, this team of sales rock stars, superheroes, people that are going out and evangelizing for your product, helping you find your next prospects and customers, helping you pull those deals through your sales pipeline. Of course, then converting and keeping and upselling those customers down the road so that you can grow and scale. The challenge, of course, is that finding salespeople is really hard. And more importantly, making a bad sales hire is really, really expensive. I mean, you can just go to Google and type in and search for topics like cost of a bad sales hire. And there's some really excellent articles out there. And here's just some basic numbers here. Here's one from a website at Visible VC. And it just says, like, the price tag alone just to hire, train, and replace a salesperson is $114,000, almost $115,000, just the actual cost, right? If you think about your recruiting costs, your salary costs, your training costs, and then what it takes to then replace that person that didn't work out, you're over $100,000 out the gate, right? The average sales manager, even if you keep somebody on staff that's not a good performer, it turns out some data shows that the average sales manager wastes 13% of their time focused on poor performers, right? So just like over 10% of your time, 10% of your day, 10% of your week is just going to be wasted trying to manage somebody who's not performing. Some bigger numbers out there is a great article from Closer IQ. When they calculated the total cost of a bad sales hire, they've calculated it as close to $400,000. Their number was $381,000. And the reason that's so is you think about not just the salary cost, the benefit cost, the recruiting cost, training cost, replacement cost, all the things that we talked about before. The other cost that you have to worry about is the opportunity cost, So if you have an enterprise salesperson or a B2B person that's handling leads that are coming in, and those leads are not converting into customers in the enterprise sales process in a B2B sales process, it might be 3 months, might be 6 months or longer before you really discover that, hey, this person I hired just isn't working out. And so you've got 3 months or 6 months of leads that should have converted at a certain rate that didn't convert. And now you're stuck holding the bag for money that didn't come into your company, right? And the last chart I want to show you here is from Rainmaker Group, where they actually showed the spread of performance between the bottom 20% of sales performers and the top 20% of sales performers. And what they found over 18 months time, what they discovered is that the difference, the cumulative difference between a top performer and a poor performer is close to over $1 million, $1.1 million. So really, really, really expensive, right? So what we want to do is avoid all of that. And so what I want to talk to you about is the 3 selling mistakes or the 3 hiring mistakes that B2B startup founders tend to make, so that you can avoid making that mistake and put yourself on the right path, go from idea to impact. And so then the first mistake that I want to talk about here, and I'm just going to draw this out or write this out, is that the first mistake, call this mistake number 1, is that founders often think Rolodex before roles. Rolodex before roles. So oftentimes when I work with founders, B2B startups, and we ask people, like, have you tried to hire salespeople in the past? What we find is that oftentimes they have tried to find a salesperson, but the person they tried to find was Mr. or Mrs. Rolodex, somebody who has lots of experience in the industry. And the challenge with that, of course, is that in the industry, you might find somebody who has lots of contacts, lots of network, lots of connections, but what are you really hiring that person to do? You're hoping that they're going to generate some sales. And so they think about a Rolodex before they think about defined roles. And a way you can think about this in terms of your overall growth strategy at your startup is based on what we call the idea to impact model. So if you think about your startup, you started your company, right? You started this company with a simple idea, right? So you have, light bulb moment. You're like, hey, I got this idea to solve a problem, to build a product, to build a service, right? And where I really want to go over time is I want to make an impact in the marketplace. I want to make an impact in the marketplace. Well, we know it doesn't just go from like idea to impact, right? We know that there's going to be a long, tough road ahead of you along that journey to go from startup to a place where you're making true impact in your market. And so we think about that in sort of 3 distinct phases. So the first phase that every startup goes through is what we call the startup phase. The second is what we call the ramp up phase. And the third is what we call the scale up phase. And each of these 3 phases have very distinct outcomes that you need to generate for yourself and for your startup. And this will help you think about the sales hiring process and how to avoid some of the mistakes that we're going to be talking about here. So in the startup phase, what are you really trying to do? If you think about it, there's basically 3 key outcomes in this startup phase. The first is you want to get what we call product problem fit. So, hey, I came up with this idea, I saw the problem, we built this product, an MVP of some kind, and look, it solves a problem in the marketplace. We're starting to show that the problem that we are out to solve is actually solved by the product that we built. And secondly, what you're trying to do is find those first customers. And thirdly, of course, is start to generate the first revenue that's available to you, right? So this is really what we're trying to do in this first part of your overall sales process, right? So the second thing we're trying to do is go from, in this startup phase, we're trying to really ultimately get what we call your first 10 paying customers. And this is often where startups make the mistake, or B2B founders make the mistake of looking at their sales hiring under the perspective of, like, I got to hire Mr. or Mrs. Rolodex, right? And the reason this is a mistake, that they think about hiring Rolodex before they think about roles, is that you're really you're just trying to establish product problem fit. Before you get product market fit, you got to get product problem fit. You're trying to figure out who those early customers are going to be. You're trying to source those on your own. So even, in a lot of ways, you might even be still experimenting with certain verticals or niches or segments in the marketplace. So jumping ahead and thinking about, like, well, we need somebody that has a Rolodex in a certain industry, like, frankly, it's just way too early for you. and you don't even know specifically how you're going to generate leads. It might be through introductions or referrals or networks. It might be through working with different types of different investors or advisors that might be able to help you out. So you really don't know what the role is of that person that you're trying to hire. You just know you like get conversations. And frankly, as a startup founder, if you're out to solve this problem in a marketplace, like you alone should do the selling. And we oftentimes call this founder-led selling. So really in the startup phase, you are the salesperson. There's no way that you can legitimately relinquish control of that sales process. Like you have to figure out how to get those first customers, how to get that first revenue, how to figure out if whether or not you have product fit or product problem fit, right? So then the second phase that we move into, once you have those first 10 paying customers, is then you can move into the ramp up phase. And that ramp up phase is really characterized by what we think about as getting to $1 million in annual recurring revenue. Well, why is that? Well, because once you get to about $1 million in annual recurring revenue, that's where oftentimes you're in a position to close a Series A or find a Series A level of funding. Coming out of the startup phase, going into the ramp up phase, you might have a couple $100,000 in revenue, anywhere from $100,000 to $300K in revenue. And this is often where you can secure a seed round or a pre-seed round of some kind, $500,000, $1 million, $2 million in revenue. But to get to a Series A, most investors will tell you like, hey, if you want to get a Series A, you got to get to $1 million of annual recurring revenue. And this is where this actually brings us to mistake number 2 that startup founders make when it comes to their sales hiring, is that the ramp up phase is really all about getting to this place of repeatability. And in order to get to repeatability, you need to have a process in place. And so specifically what you need to do is thinking about how are we generating leads? What are the systems that we use to generate leads? How do we do our prospecting to get new people into the funnel? Secondly, how do we think about our sales pipeline? How do we run our demos? How do we answer objections? How do we think about integrations and implementations? How do we think about pricing? And then the third piece that you need to be thinking about is your customers. Customer success, customer onboarding, customer implementation, customer training, all the things that go to make sure that your customers are successful. And in order to get to $1 million in sales, then that's where you need to have really good systems in place. Some sort of version 1.0 of lead generation and filling the funnel, lead qualification, some kind of template and process for how you run your product demos, right? How do you think about pricing in a more standardized way that back in that ramp up, in that startup phase, you might be willing to do lots of deals and give bespoke pricing models. But to get to $1 million, you start to grow your customer base, you need to have a lot more consistency, right? And so this leads us to mistake number 2 is that startup founders make is that they think about people. Let me just write this down. Mistake number 2 is they think about people before they think about process. So just like in that startup phase where you start thinking about like, hey, if I just had somebody with a big Rolodex that can make lots of introductions, then everything would be great. Well, even if you get to a place where you can, you start to get a sense for these are the markets that we're going to go after. This is the vertical or the niche or the segment. And we know these are the kinds of buyers that we need to be speaking with. Oftentimes then the sense is like, whew, as a founder, I've gotten my 10 customers. Now let me just like throw sales off to someone else. Like, hey, if I could just find a salesperson now to take over sales, then everything would be great, right? Well, the reason that's a mistake is because you need to know what kind of processes you're running so that you know what kind of people to hire. And that's this idea of systems or process that I described up here. So the systems and process are so important because you need to know what are the lead generation activities that need to be happening every day. Is it inbound? Is it outbound? Is it using LinkedIn? Is it using webinars? Is it using content marketing? Is it using speaking and conferences and podcasts, right? Without knowing that system of lead generation, then without having a process in place, how are you going to know what person to hire? Right? If you think about hiring an SDR, there's all kinds of different skill sets around being an SDR. Some are really good at handling inbound leads. Some are really good hunters and good at doing outbound. If you don't even know whether or not you're getting leads consistently from inbound or outbound, how are you going to know what kind of person to hire in that role? Right? And the same with the middle of your sales pipeline, right? If you think about what it takes to convert a deal after they've been qualified, right? Some people think, well, if I just had a salesperson that could just like find customers and then convert a bunch of deals and close them and get some contracts signed. Well, like the way that you sell at your company is going to be different than the way other companies sell. Maybe there's a set of standard meetings that you have to have. Maybe there's a heavy amount of technical buyers that need to get involved. And so you might need an account executive that's very technical in nature that can answer a lot of those technical questions, or maybe not, in which case you don't need somebody like that. Maybe you need somebody with lots of industry expertise, because as you get further into the sales process, there's lots of conversation that's going on around compliance or risk or some other part of your product and the problem it solves that require your customers to know, like, hey, this person on the other side really knows what they're talking about, right? So when I was at Blend, some of the earliest team members that we hired on our sales and customer service team, our customer success team, they were all people that had industry experience in the mortgage industry. Now, they hadn't sold mortgage software before, but we had one person who had done consulting for PwC in mortgage compliance. We had two people that had traded mortgage-backed securities on Wall Street, right? So they understood the mortgage market, and we could put those people in front of any bank executive and they could talk about mortgages and mortgage origination and mortgage process. And that person on the other side could feel confident that, hey, this person I'm talking to from Blend, they really know mortgages. That was a case where we needed to have some level of industry expertise. That might not be the case, but until you know your sales process, like we had to learn at Blend that, hey, later in the sale, we're going to have lots of mortgage process related conversations. We can't just like pull some account executive that has pharmaceutical sales experience. They're not going to be successful. Then it would have been impossible for us to know what kind of people to hire. And that's the mistake number two that most people make, is like, if I just had a salesperson, let me get somebody in that can just run sales for me without really knowing your process, right? So that's mistake number two. And so now when you get to this ramp up stage and let's say you get to that $1 million or $2 million in annual recurring revenue, the last thing we want to do is think about like, well, now we can get to a place of scale, right? And to get to a place of scale, there's three things that you have to be able to measure or that you have to be able to implement. Number one is you have to know your metrics. Right? So think about yourself as a founder. At this point in the business, you should now have a sense for like, what's the dashboard for the sales function in our business? Like, how many leads should we be getting every week based on certain campaigns? How many deals should we have in our sales pipeline? What should be the conversion rates? What's the average contract value? What's our customer acquisition cost? Or you should know all of those things by the time you get to a Series A. You should have those metrics. You should have that dashboard to know how the company runs. Right. And that goes back to having these processes in place so you know what to measure and how to measure them. Right. The second thing you then need to do at that point is then think about your hiring around the team. Once you know the metrics and you know the process and the roles and the responsibilities, then you can say, hey, we need SDRs to do this function. We need AEs that are experts in our market area. We need customer success people that are really good at training, because our specific solution has lots of different implementation types. Right. So once you know the metrics, then you can hire the people that can hit those metrics. And then the third thing you have to do is think about team management, right? But to get to that place of scale, right, to get to that place where you have a team around you, you need to have, number one, the systems in place, the processes in place, so you know what kind of people to hire and how to measure them. And secondly, this is only something that you can do and you can lead as a founder, right? So that's sort of the second explanation around the second mistake that most founders make. Now, if we want to sort of like wrap this up and say, well, what's the third mistake that a lot of founders make? This is more of thinking about like the tech stack. Oftentimes, what I see is that, and mistake number three is this sense, and frankly, the world has become very software driven, right? We all know that. The problem with that, of course, and this leads us to another mistake number three, is that teams and founders often think software before systems, right? They think software before systems. So you can go out today, right, and you can buy software that will allow you to send lots of emails out and do a big batch and blast to a list. You can hire somebody to create lists for you, right? You can outsource that whole process, right? There are CRMs, and then there's software that will help you track if people have opened emails or not. And then you have all these systems in place. Then you have if-thens. If somebody opened this email, then send them that email. You've got your CRM where you can be logging deals in pipeline. You can connect your CRM to your marketing software if you're using something like HubSpot or ActiveCampaign or some other marketing automation platform, right? It's easy to sort of like build this big tech stack and say like, hey, we're going to automate sales. Like we're going to make this really easy and really efficient. We're going to get a bunch of leads. We're going to pump 1,000 people into the software platform, batch and blast them, and then send 1,000 emails and hope that we get a couple meetings booked. And then we're going to have Calendly to let people automatically book their meetings. And then we're going to have these reminders that get sent. And then after every single demo, then we're going to have this other system that's going to send them recordings of the demo that we just did. And you've got like all of this software that's working as like a set of machinery, but you really don't know what systems need to be working in that software. And what I mean by that specifically is going back to this middle stage here, the ramp up stage. When we talk about systems, we're not talking about software systems. We're talking about your system for lead generation, right? What are the actual emails that get sent and get open and get replies? What is the actual number of emails that need to get sent in order to get a reply? Where are the people that you need to target? Where are they spending time? Are they spending time on LinkedIn? And in which case, LinkedIn needs to be a lead generation part of your lead generation strategy. That is a system unto itself. Maybe it's using webinars and using live events. That needs to be a system, a live event system for saying, hey, we're going to run a webinar once a month. And after we run that webinar every month, then what we're going to do is use that as a way to pump people into that event. And then after the event is over, then we look for a way to then convert those into calls that gets booked. None of that really requires a lot of software. So the mistake that a lot of founders make is like, we're going to buy this big tech stack, implement a tech stack, and then just dump process into it that we think works, but not really knowing what works and what doesn't work. So those are the three biggest mistakes or three of the mistakes that I see startup founders make every day. And so the way you want to think about avoiding those, the way to avoid those mistakes is number one, the first way to avoid this mistake is just know that if you are truly in that stage where you're just trying to get your first 10 paying customers, then you need to be the salesperson. You need to lead sales. You need to do sales. It needs to be founder-led selling. You can't outsource that to Mr. or Mrs. Rolodex. There's no other person in the world that's going to be able to sell this product because, frankly, if you can't sell this product that you've changed your entire life in order to build and sell, then there's probably nobody in this world that's going to be able to sell it. So the way to avoid mistake number one is just to accept the responsibility and commit to saying, I will get those first 10 customers, right? To avoid mistake number two, which is hiring people instead of thinking about process, is, just because you've got those first 10 customers, don't jump from startup to scale up. You have to accept the fact that there's this ramp up stage that is all focused on building the right systems, building the right process, establishing how you're generating leads, establishing and building that sales playbook around how you're managing your active deals. And then thirdly, thinking about what are the pricing and conversion and training and onboarding and implementation systems. Like you've got to have those systems in place. And they don't have to be perfect. Perfect is always the enemy of done. But most importantly, you have to think about, like, do I at least have a version 1.0? Do I have some predictable way of generating leads so that if I'm doing a customer implementation and focused on that for a couple of weeks, do I know that if I go to my email box at the end of the day that we're going to have a couple of new leads coming in? Or if I spend a little bit of time on LinkedIn, I know I can generate some new conversations. There needs to be some predictability and repeatability around that. So that's how you avoid mistake number two. And number three is just focused on making sure that you have some documentation and systems in place before before buying software, because if you don't know what those systems are, then how are you going to know what software platforms work best? So those are the three biggest mistakes and how to avoid them when it comes to being a B2B startup founder. One of the things I wanted to make sure to do, and in the comments or in the post here on LinkedIn, there's a link that if you are in a process where you've avoided these three mistakes and you are ready to start hiring out a sales team, we have a complete sales hiring system that we built and that we implement all the time with our clients as part of our startup selling coaching program. So if you want to get a copy of that, it's an entire recorded training and a complete workbook. Be happy to send that to you. So there's a link in the post here on LinkedIn that you can use. Just click on that link, pop in your email address so we know where to send it, and then we'll be able to send that to you over the course of the next day. And so that's it. This is the 3 hiring mistakes that I see B2B startup founders make all the time and how to avoid them. If you got any questions, then just send me a DM. If you feel like you're in this middle zone somewhere where you're like coming out of founder-led selling, starting to ramp up your sales, you're on that path to getting to $1 million in ARR in the next 12 to 16 months, and you want some help with systems and process, then that's exactly what we do every day, right? If you don't have repeatable systems, if you don't have predictability, if you don't have scalability in your sales process, you're never going to be able to scale up and make the impact that you want to make with your startup. So that's what we do really well with our coaching program. So if you want some more help with that, then you can just send me a DM with the word private, and I can share how the team and I can help you with that. So that's it for now.